The Dead Hand, the Soviet Union's automatic apocalypse machine. The Doomsday? Fear. In the final decades of the Cold War, the world lived under a shadow so vast and terrifying that most people tried not to think about it: the possibility of sudden nuclear annihilation. For decades, both the United States and the Soviet Union had amassed arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, a chilling question haunted Soviet leaders. What if the United States struck first, and struck so decisively that the Soviet command structure was wiped out before it could order a retaliation? This was not an abstract fear. U.S. nuclear doctrine included the concept of a decapitation strike, a massive first strike aimed at destroying the enemy's leadership, command bunkers, and communications in one blow. With the deployment of highly accurate intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and Pershing II missiles in Europe, capable of reaching Moscow in minutes, the Soviets feared their top leadership might not have enough time to react. A first strike could, in theory, blind and paralyze them before a single order of retaliation was given. For the Soviet Union, whose entire security doctrine rested on the certainty of mutually assured destruction, this was unacceptable. Deterrence only worked if the enemy knew that any attack would be met with an unstoppable counterattack. If the Americans believed they could knock out the Soviet leadership in one swift strike, deterrence would collapse. The Kremlin needed a way to guarantee retaliation, even if every general, every bunker, and even the General Secretary himself were reduced to ash in a nuclear firestorm. The solution was as audacious as it was terrifying. Build a machine that could launch the apocalypse automatically. This system would later be known in the West as the Dead Hand. To the Soviets, it was perimeter. It was not a single missile or bomb, but an entire command and control network designed to detect nuclear war and respond without human input if necessary. Sensors would monitor seismic activity, radiation levels, and signs of nuclear detonations across Soviet territory. If explosions were detected, and if communications with high command were severed, the system could decide that the leadership had been destroyed. At that point, perimeter would issue the order itself: unleash the full Soviet arsenal in a massive retaliatory strike. To American strategists, the idea sounded like madness, an apocalyptic autopilot. Yet for the Soviets, it was the ultimate guarantee of deterrence. Even if Washington somehow succeeded in decapitating the Soviet command, the Americans would still face total destruction. There would be no way to escape retaliation. No missile defense could protect them. No bunker could save their leaders. The dead hand meant that even in death, the Soviet Union's hand would remain on the trigger. The very existence of such a system carried enormous psychological weight. Whether or not it was ever activated or even fully operational mattered less than the fear it inspired. The mere possibility that the Soviets had delegated the power to end civilization to an automated machine forced U.S. planners to think twice. Nuclear war, already a game of impossible risks, became even more dangerous when machines might decide humanity's fate. In this way, the dead hand was both a weapon and a message. It was a chilling signal to the West. You cannot win a nuclear war. Even if you kill us all, our machines will finish the job. It was deterrence taken to its most extreme, a reminder that in the Cold War, survival was secured not through trust or peace, but through the constant looming threat of annihilation. Origins of the Dead Hand. To understand why the Soviet Union built the Dead Hand, we need to step back into the tense atmosphere of the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period when the Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases. Détente was collapsing, U.S.-Soviet relations were hardening, and both sides were modernizing their nuclear arsenals with unprecedented speed. The Kremlin, in particular, felt increasingly vulnerable. One of the main triggers was the deployment of American Pershing, 2 missiles and cruise missiles in Western Europe. These weapons could strike Moscow and key command centers in as little as 6 to 10 minutes. To Soviet leaders, this was alarming. A nuclear exchange could unfold so quickly that their decision-making window shrank to almost nothing. The General Secretary and the military high command might not have time to confirm an attack, convene, and launch a counterstrike before they were vaporized. At the same time, the United States was developing increasingly sophisticated decapitation strategies. The idea was that instead of targeting cities first, a U.S. strike might aim to destroy Soviet leadership, command bunkers, and communications infrastructure, crippling their ability to respond. In theory, if Washington could kill the brain of the Soviet system, the body, the nuclear arsenal, would never move. For Moscow, whose entire nuclear doctrine was based on the certainty of retaliation, this was an existential threat. The Soviets had long invested in survivable command structures, from hardened bunkers deep under Moscow to underground communication cables stretching across the vastness of the USSR. But as technology advanced, they began to doubt whether even these defenses would be enough. If NATO's missiles could destroy bunkers in minutes, what good were they? It was within this climate of paranoia that the idea of an automated system of retaliation began to take hold. The logic was brutal but clear. If the leadership could be eliminated in a first strike, then the power to order a counterstrike had to be delegated to a system that could survive and act independently. Humans were too slow, too vulnerable. Machines, linked to sensors and pre-programmed logic, could guarantee that the Soviet arsenal would not die with its commanders. Thus, in the early 1980s, Soviet engineers and military planners began designing what they called perimeter. It was a system that fused computer networks, hardened command bunkers, and special missiles designed not to carry warheads, but to transmit launch orders. In effect, it was a doomsday communication system. Even if every telephone line was cut, even if every general was dead, perimeter could still awaken the sleeping arsenal and unleash Armageddon. The decision to build such a system was also shaped by history. The Soviets never forgot the shock of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when Nazi Germany's surprise invasion devastated their forces in the opening days of the war. That trauma lingered, the idea that enemies could strike suddenly and decapitate Soviet defenses. The dead hand was, in part, a technological answer to that historical fear. Never again would Russia risk being caught unprepared. Officially, the system remained a tightly guarded secret. Few outside the highest levels of the Soviet military-industrial complex even knew it existed. In fact, Western analysts debated for years whether such a system could be real or whether it was a phantom meant to sow fear. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union would details emerge, confirming that perimeter had indeed been built and, according to some sources, may still be active in some form today. In the end, the origins of the dead hand reveal not a story of technological ambition, but of profound insecurity. Faced with the possibility that their command structure could be wiped out in minutes, the Soviets responded with chilling logic: delegate survival to machines. Better to risk apocalypse by automation than to risk annihilation by inaction. Anatomy of the system. On the surface, the dead hand, known within the Soviet Union as perimeter, looked like science fiction, a machine that could decide when to end the world. Yet in practice, the system was not a single button or computer, but a sprawling web of sensors, bunkers, communication nodes, and missiles designed to guarantee that retaliation would occur no matter what. At the heart of perimeter were sensors. These were designed to detect the unmistakable signs of nuclear war, Seismic vibrations from massive explosions, sudden spikes in radiation, or even changes in air pressure caused by multiple warheads detonating. Combined with satellite data and radar reports, the system could piece together whether a nuclear attack was unfolding across Soviet territory. The second layer was command bunkers, deep underground facilities hardened to withstand direct nuclear strikes. Inside these bunkers, specialized computers and staff monitored the data flowing in from the sensors. If communications with the political and military leadership were still intact, perimeter would remain dormant. But if those channels went silent, if Moscow's command posts were destroyed or cut off, the system would shift to its deadly next phase. That phase involved the most unique element of the dead hand: command missiles. Unlike ordinary nuclear missiles designed to destroy cities, these carried no warheads. Instead, their payload was a powerful radio transmitter. If launched, these missiles would soar high into the atmosphere and broadcast coded launch orders to the scattered network of Soviet missile silos, submarines, and bombers. In effect, they were the voice of the dead, ensuring that even if every phone line and radio tower was destroyed, the order to retaliate would still reach the arsenal. The logic was chilling but elegant. Imagine a scenario where the Soviet leadership is annihilated in a first strike. Nuclear firestorms engulf Moscow, silos are under siege, and communication lines are severed. In that chaos, perimeter activates. Sensors confirm nuclear detonations. Silence from command posts signals that leaders are gone. The system launches its command missiles, and within minutes, the entire surviving Soviet arsenal receives the order to fire. Even in the ashes of defeat, retaliation is guaranteed. The system also had safeguards. Contrary to the Hollywood image of a runaway machine, perimeter was not entirely autonomous. It could not simply decide on its own to launch Armageddon. Human operators had to activate it during a crisis, placing it into a state of combat readiness. Once armed, however, if the right conditions were met, nuclear detonations detected, communications lost, and no signs of surviving leadership, the system would execute its grim mission automatically. This blend of human oversight and automated execution made perimeter both plausible and terrifying. It reassured Soviet leaders that they could never be disarmed by a decapitation strike. But it also meant that once activated, events could spiral out of human control. A malfunctioning sensor, a false alarm, or a misinterpretation could, in theory, trigger the end of the world. For years, the details of this system remained speculative. Western analysts could only guess at its existence, piecing together hints from satellite photos and intelligence leaks. Only after the Soviet Union collapsed did Russian officials confirm many aspects of it. Accounts from former officers revealed the outlines: the sensors, the bunkers, the command missiles. While exact technical details remain classified, the broad architecture has been acknowledged. The anatomy of the dead hand reveals the sheer lengths the Soviet Union went to preserve deterrence. It was not a single device, but a networked machine of fear, a system that turned radiation detectors and seismic sensors into the triggers of apocalypse. More than any missile or bomb, it embodied the terrible logic of the nuclear age: survival through guaranteed destruction, even when no one was left alive to order it. Strategy of terror. The dead hand was never just a technical system, it was a weapon of psychology, a machine built to alter the very logic of nuclear war. To grasp its true purpose, one must understand how deterrence worked during the Cold War. Nuclear strategy rested on the grim doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate with equal or greater force, ensuring that both would be annihilated. The knowledge of this inevitability was meant to prevent either side from ever pressing the button. but MAD depended on human beings, generals, presidents, premiers, being alive to make decisions. The Americans developed decapitation strategies designed to knock out Soviet leadership in minutes, using precise warheads targeted at bunkers and communication lines. If Washington could destroy the Soviet command before it gave the order to retaliate, deterrence might collapse. The dead hand was designed to close that gap by guaranteeing retaliation even without human hands on the trigger. This gave the system its terrifying power. The mere knowledge that the dead hand existed forced U.S. planners to assume that a decapitation strike would not work. Even if they vaporized the Kremlin, obliterated the general staff, and silenced the command bunkers, retaliation would still come, because the machine would order it. In this way, the dead hand amplified deterrence by making Soviet retaliation not just possible, but inevitable. Yet there was a darker psychological layer. By building such a system, the Soviets signaled to the world that they were willing to entrust Armageddon to machines. It was an implicit admission that in the ultimate crisis, survival of the state mattered more than human judgment. In Western eyes, this looked reckless, almost nihilistic. What if sensors malfunctioned? What if a solar flare or earthquake mimicked a nuclear explosion? The Americans worried that an automated system could transform a false alarm into the end of civilization. But for the Soviets, this very unpredictability was part of the weapon. The United States had long used ambiguity. Strategic bombers constantly in the air, submarines hiding in the oceans, to keep adversaries guessing. The dead hand turned that ambiguity into terror. American generals could never be certain whether perimeter was armed, active, or standing by. That uncertainty alone was enough to strengthen deterrence. The system also embodied a particularly Soviet way of thinking about war: defense through inevitability. Soviet history was scarred by invasions. Napoleon in 1812, Hitler in 1941, that began with devastating surprise attacks. The lesson was seared into their doctrine. Never again would Russia be destroyed because it failed to strike back. The dead hand was the technological embodiment of that lesson. Even if the first blow decapitated them, the second blow, apocalyptic and unstoppable, would fall on the attacker. For NATO, the existence of such a system complicated strategy. It made limited nuclear war, already a dubious concept, even more impossible. If a few warheads fell on Soviet soil, how could Washington know whether perimeter might interpret it as the end and unleash the full arsenal? The dead hand blurred the line between tactical escalation and total destruction. Once nuclear weapons flew, the risk that machines might finish the job made restraint seem almost impossible. This was the ultimate paradox of the dead hand. By making nuclear war less controllable, it paradoxically made it less likely. If everyone feared that the machines would take over, no one would dare to start the sequence in the first place. The Soviets had built not only a weapon of retaliation, but a weapon of terror, a silent threat hanging over every strategic calculation in Washington. In the end, the dead hand was less about pressing a button and more about planting a thought: even if you kill us, we will still kill you. It was deterrence taken to its logical extreme, where humanity's survival hinged not on diplomacy, not on leadership, but on a machine waiting in the shadows to finish what humans had begun. Secrets and myths. For decades, the dead hand existed in a fog of rumor, speculation, and fear. Unlike nuclear missiles or bombers, which could be paraded in military displays or tracked by satellites, perimeter left almost no physical footprint. Its power lay in its secrecy. Even within the Soviet Union, only a handful of senior military officials and engineers knew its full design. To the outside world, it was a ghost, a system that might exist or might not, but that had to be considered in every calculation of war. During the Cold War, Western intelligence agencies struggled to confirm its reality. Analysts pieced together fragments, reports of strange new command bunkers, whispers from defectors, and suspicious missile tests. Some believed that perimeter was a bluff, a psychological weapon designed to spook Washington into caution. Others argued that it had to be real, because only such a system could explain the confidence with which Soviet leaders spoke about their retaliatory capability. The first hints of its existence began surfacing in the 1980s, but it was not until the late 1990s and 2000s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that the truth emerged. Retired Soviet officers and scientists began to speak more openly, confirming that perimeter was indeed built, tested, and, at least at one time, operational. These accounts described its structure: the network of seismic and radiation sensors, the underground bunkers, the specialized command missiles designed to transmit launch orders. Suddenly, what had once been dismissed as rumor was revealed as terrifying reality. Yet even with these confirmations, myths and uncertainties persisted. Some claimed that the dead hand was fully automated, capable of launching the entire Soviet arsenal without any human input. Others insisted it required activation by surviving commanders before entering its dead hand state. The truth lies somewhere in between. Perimeter could not trigger itself from a peacetime state, but once armed, it could function with chilling independence if conditions were met. Another myth concerned its status after the end of the Cold War. Was it dismantled after 1991, when Russia inherited the Soviet arsenal? Or was it quietly maintained, modernized, and perhaps even improved with digital technologies? Officially, Russian leaders have been ambiguous. Some statements suggest it remains on standby, a last resort deterrent. Others hint that it has been retired. The deliberate uncertainty is part of its power, forcing adversaries to assume that the dead hand may still be waiting in the shadows. The secrecy around perimeter also generated cultural myths. In the West, it became almost legendary, a machine of apocalypse akin to something from a dystopian novel. Journalists dubbed it the Dead Hand, a name that stuck because it captured the essence of the system, a hand that would strike even after the body was gone. Films, novels, and documentaries amplified the fear, portraying perimeter as a runaway doomsday machine capable of ending humanity by mistake. In reality, the system was more restrained than its mythology suggested. It was designed with safeguards, and it could not simply wake up on its own. But its myths endure because they tap into a deeper fear: the idea that humans might one day build machines that decide the fate of civilization. In that sense, the dead hand was a precursor to modern anxieties about artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. What remains clear is that secrecy was not a flaw of perimeter. It was the point. By leaving the world uncertain, the Soviets magnified its deterrent effect. Fear of the unknown was as powerful as any missile. Even today, no one outside Russia can say with certainty whether the dead hand is still alive. That ambiguity is its final enduring myth. Risks and consequences. Every weapon carries risks, but the dead hand was in a class of its own. Unlike bombers or missiles, which could be launched or recalled by human decision, perimeter placed the fate of nations in the hands of machines. Its very design, delegating the power of nuclear retaliation to a system of sensors and automated command missiles, opened a Pandora's box of dangers that extended far beyond its strategic logic. The most obvious risk was accidental escalation. Perimeter relied on a network of instruments to detect nuclear detonations, radiation spikes, seismic vibrations, and the loss of communications with command centers. But what if those sensors malfunctioned? Earthquakes, solar storms, or even massive conventional explosions might mimic the signatures of nuclear war. In theory, safeguards were in place. The system had to be armed by human operators before it could act autonomously. Yet, once armed, its ability to launch retaliation without direct human approval meant that errors could, in the worst-case scenario, trigger Armageddon. There was also the danger of misinterpretation in a crisis. Imagine a period of heightened tension. Troops massed on borders, leaders trading threats, nuclear forces on alert. If communications with Moscow suddenly went dark due to a technical failure or cyber attack, Perimeter might interpret the silence as proof that the leadership had been destroyed. In that context, the line between a malfunction and the apocalypse would be razor-thin. The mere existence of the system added volatility to already unstable confrontations. Beyond technical risks, there was the philosophical danger. By building the dead hand, the Soviets normalized the idea of removing humans from the final decision to end civilization. It represented a profound shift in the ethics of warfare. For thousands of years, the power of life and death in war rested with rulers, generals, and soldiers, flawed but conscious beings. Perimeter transferred that responsibility to algorithms, sensors, and pre-programmed triggers. For many in the West, this was madness, the abdication of humanity's ultimate responsibility to machines. Another consequence was the psychological effect on strategy. If U.S. leaders believed that Perimeter was always active, they might assume that any nuclear use, even limited, would automatically provoke full-scale retaliation. That perception made the nuclear standoff even more brittle. Instead of stabilizing deterrence, Perimeter risked creating a hair-trigger environment where both sides feared that even the smallest spark could ignite global fire. For the Soviet Union itself, there were also internal risks. Operating such a system required secrecy so deep that even many senior officials were kept in the dark. This secrecy could lead to confusion, mismanagement, or lack of oversight. If the chain of knowledge was too narrow, could anyone truly guarantee that the system would function correctly in the chaos of nuclear war? Or that it would not malfunction catastrophically? Then there is the question of today. If Perimeter, or a modernized version of it, still exists within Russia's arsenal, the risks may be even greater. Modern cyber warfare introduces new vulnerabilities. Could hackers disrupt or spoof signals to the system? Could electronic warfare create false alarms? While the original Perimeter was built in the analog age, its survival into the digital era raises unsettling questions about the safety of entrusting Armageddon to any automated structure. Ultimately, the dead hand epitomized the paradox of nuclear deterrence. Its purpose was to prevent war by making it unthinkable. But by existing, it also created new paths to catastrophe. Paths where accidents, malfunctions, or misunderstandings might unleash destruction without a single conscious decision. It was deterrence by terror, but also deterrence by risk. The consequences of such a system go beyond strategy. They touch on the deepest anxieties of human civilization. The fear that we might build machines capable of ending us and then lose control of them. The dead hand was not just a Soviet weapon. It was a glimpse of a future where humanity's survival might hang on the decisions of systems we can no longer fully control. The shadow of the dead hand. The dead hand remains one of the most haunting legacies of the Cold War. Unlike missiles on parade or bombers flying overhead, it was never meant to be seen. Its power lay in the invisible, in the uncertainty that it might be watching, waiting, ready to turn silence into apocalypse. And even decades after its creation, the shadow it cast has never truly faded. For the Soviet Union, Perimeter was the ultimate insurance policy. It answered the fear of a decapitation strike, guaranteeing that no matter what happened to the leadership, the state would strike back. In this sense, It was a weapon born of weakness as much as strength. Lacking the economic power to match the United States missile for missile, the Soviets built instead a machine of inevitability, a system that promised annihilation even from the grave. For the world, however, the existence of the dead hand raised terrifying questions. What does it mean when humans build machines to decide humanity's fate? Can deterrence be entrusted to algorithms and sensors? And perhaps most chilling of all, what if such a system still exists, lurking within Russia's nuclear arsenal today, updated and modernized for the digital age? Official statements have been deliberately ambiguous. Some suggest perimeter has been dismantled. Others insist it remains operational. That ambiguity is not an accident. It is part of the system's deterrent power. As long as the world cannot be sure, the fear remains. The dead hand also speaks to a broader truth about the Cold War, that survival was not guaranteed by peace, but by fear. Both superpowers invested in weapons so destructive that they could never be used, hoping that the certainty of destruction would prevent anyone from pressing the button. It worked, but only barely. The world came dangerously close to catastrophe more than once, saved not by machines, but by human hesitation, luck, and the restraint of individuals who refused to let the logic of annihilation play out. And yet, perimeter is a reminder of what might happen if that hesitation is removed. It shows us the thin line between control and chaos, between strategy and suicide. It embodies the paradox at the heart of nuclear deterrence, that in order to preserve life, we built systems designed to end it. Today, the name Dead Hand lingers in the imagination like a ghost. It represents the fear that our creations can outlive us, that the tools we build for security can become the instruments of our destruction. Whether or not the system remains active, its legacy is clear. It changed the way nations thought about deterrence, and it left behind a chilling question that echoes into our own time. In the end, the dead hand is not just a relic of the Cold War, it is a warning that in the pursuit of absolute security, humanity can stumble into absolute peril, that in building machines of fear, we risk creating futures where survival depends not on reason or judgment, but on automated triggers buried deep beneath the earth, and that perhaps the greatest danger of all is not the weapons we point at each other, but the shadows they leave behind.